America isn't waiting for the next recession. We've already stepped into it. Despite the confident speeches coming out of Washington about economic strength and resilience, the reality on the ground tells a very different story. Debt levels are spiraling out of control, foreclosure notices are piling up faster than at any point in recent memory, and several state governments are barely holding together their budgets. Moody's has already sounded the alarm, noting that almost one-third of the nation's economic output has slipped into recession-level contraction. Pension funds that millions rely on are running dry. Credit ratings across multiple regions are downgrading, and families are abandoning their home states in massive numbers, not for adventure, but out of necessity. The idea of the American dream has shifted. It's no longer a promise. It feels more like a ticking timer counting down. This isn't speculation or another dramatic prediction. It's unfolding right now, in real time. What follows are the 12 states buckling first, as the United States enters what may become the most serious economic downturn we've faced in a generation. Number 12. Colorado. Colorado used to be held up as the shining example of tech-driven growth and high-altitude prosperity, but behind the postcard views of Denver's skyline and Boulder's trail-lined hills, the foundation is starting to crumble, and it's happening faster than most people realize. Housing is the first red flag. The typical home price is still hovering around $570,000, while the average household income sits near $92,000. In practical terms, that means a normal family would have to pour almost half of their take-home pay into a mortgage just to keep a roof overhead. That's not thriving, that's survival with a view. Unemployment is rising too, now sitting at 4.3%, the worst since early 2021. A big part of that surge comes from massive layoffs in tech. More than 11,000 jobs vanished in 2024, as giants like Google, Zoom, and Salesforce pulled back from the pandemic hiring frenzy. Downtown Denver tells the same story. Office buildings are sitting dark and empty, with vacancy rates above 31%, the highest ever recorded in Colorado. Some landlords are slashing rents by nearly 40% just to keep tenants from walking away. Commercial property values have already plunged 25% from their peak in 2022, and business loan delinquencies have doubled in a single year. The state budget doesn't offer comfort either. Colorado is headed toward a $1.6 billion deficit by 2026, driven by shrinking tax revenue and skyrocketing pension costs. The state retirement system, PIRA, now carries about $35 billion in unfunded promises. That's not a small problem, that's a fiscal time bomb just quietly ticking in the background. Even tourism, Colorado's long-trusted safety net, is losing steam. Visitor spending fell 7% in 2024, and ski resorts saw traffic drop 10%, hurt by fewer international travelers and sky-high lodging prices. Outside the major cities, the picture gets even tougher. In rural areas like Pueblo and Mesa County, foreclosures are climbing fast, nearly 1 in every 310 homes, some of the worst rates in the entire Mountain West. And when this recession tightens its grip even further, Colorado's inflated property values and growing debt may collapse suddenly, like a mountainside avalanche that gives no warning before it breaks loose. Number 11. Mississippi. Mississippi has worn the label of America's poorest state for decades, but 2025 may be the year when its already fragile economic foundation finally buckles. The struggles here aren't new, but they're accelerating, and this time the state may not have the safety nets it once relied on. Start with income. The typical household in Mississippi earns just $49,111 a year, not even two-thirds of the national average. Poverty isn't an exception here, it's the daily reality. 18.1% of residents, or almost 1 out of every 5 people, live below the poverty line. Unemployment has climbed to 5.2%, and labor force participation is stuck at 55.6%, the lowest rate in the entire country. That means nearly half the working-age population isn't even in the job market. And behind the scenes, Mississippi is being propped up by Washington more than any other state. Nearly 46%, almost half of its entire state budget, comes from federal aid. With federal spending cuts on the horizon and a wider recession tightening, that support may fade fast. If those funds shrink, the shockwaves will hit hard, not just in government offices, but in schools, hospitals, and essential services that rural communities depend on. Housing, another warning sign. The typical home costs around $176,000, which might sound affordable, but stagnating wages and high mortgage rates have frozen the market. Foreclosures are up 32% from last year, hammering cities like Jackson and Greenville. And speaking of Greenville, economists expect the sharpest housing price drop in the entire nation there, a projected 16.6% decline by mid-2025. Commercial life isn't faring better. Across smaller towns, storefronts are emptying out, Local retail is shrinking sharply as business vacancies rise 18% and families turn to credit just to get by, pushing credit card debt to historic highs. Then there's the infrastructure crisis. Nearly 28% of the state's bridges are now classified as structurally deficient, and taxpayer-backed debt is approaching $7,800 per person. Roads, utilities, and buildings are aging faster than the state can repair them, and perhaps most alarming, Mississippi's healthcare system is breaking down. Since 2020, 6 rural hospitals have shut their doors, leaving more than 300,000 residents without nearby emergency medical care. In these communities, getting sick is no longer just frightening, it can be fatal. This isn't the beginning of a downturn for Mississippi, it may be the start of a fundamental unraveling. Number 10. Maryland. Maryland has always benefited from being wrapped around the nation's capital. For decades, proximity to Washington, D.C. was its economic superpower. But today, that same reliance has become the state's biggest vulnerability, and the cracks are starting to show. Maryland is entering storm weather with a dangerous combination: extremely high living costs, slowing employment momentum, and a heavy dependence on federal dollars. More than 28,700 federal employees work inside Maryland, the highest concentration in the country relative to population. So when Congress freezes hiring, trims agency budgets, or delays programs, those paychecks don't just disappear. The tax revenue that funds Maryland's government disappears with them. Wall Street sees the risk clearly. Moody's has already lowered Maryland's credit outlook for 2025, signaling concern that the state has become too tied to federal spending cycles. Housing is another pressure point. The typical home price is sitting near $430,000. Yet even with a strong-sounding median income of $98,400, Maryland families are struggling to keep up. Inflation, soaring property taxes, and mortgage rates around 7% are squeezing budgets to the breaking point. Foreclosures have jumped 29% since 2023, and Baltimore now has more than 95 bank-owned homes, one of the highest shares in the country. Office towers and commercial centers aren't faring any better. Vacancy rates in the Baltimore metro area are now above 22%, and office rent has sunk to under $19 a square foot, the lowest level in 10 years. Even the once-celebrated biotech hub in Montgomery County is shrinking, with venture capital investment collapsing by 40% year-over-year and high-skilled jobs quietly disappearing. On the fiscal side, the picture grows darker. Maryland is staring at a $700 million budget gap by 2026, while public pension obligations march toward $25 billion. The state's rainy day reserve, about $2.9 billion, would last less than a year if a severe downturn hits. In other words, the cushion is thin, and the fall could be hard. There's a bitter irony here. One of the most educated states in America, a region packed with engineers, analysts, and researchers, may become one of the first to feel the economic earthquake from a shrinking federal footprint. For years, government-anchored wealth masked deeper structural risks. Now those risks are surfacing. Number 9. Delaware. Delaware may be small, but the trouble building inside its borders is anything but. With barely over 1 million residents, this state has long relied on a very specific economic formula: corporate registrations, chemical production, and a strong banking footprint. But the ground under that model is shifting fast, and Delaware is no longer as steady as it once seemed. For decades, companies flocked to Delaware to incorporate. That pipeline funded nearly a third of the state budget. Now that engine is sputtering. Corporate tax revenue plunged 14% in 2024, marking the steepest drop in 20 years. Businesses are increasingly choosing lower tax competitors like Texas and Florida, and Delaware's once untouchable status as America's corporate home base is starting to crack. The consequences are already visible. State officials expect a $1.1 billion deficit in 2025, which translates to roughly $1,050 per resident, an enormous hole for such a small population to fill. And everyday families aren't catching a break either. With median home prices hovering near $370,000 and household incomes sitting around $76,000, affordability has collapsed. Nearly 38% of a typical family's monthly income now goes straight toward a mortgage, a burden that only becomes heavier as interest rates remain elevated. Foreclosures have surged 27% year-over-year, most notably in New Castle County and Dover, signaling growing financial strain across communities. The job market tells the same story. Unemployment has climbed to 4.6%, and key industries like finance and manufacturing have shed 11% of their positions in just 1 year. Inflation isn't helping. Grocery and energy costs are still climbing more than 6% annually, hitting working-class households hardest. Then there's the state's retirement system. Delaware owes $8.4 billion in pension obligations, yet only about 65% of that is actually funded. Local municipalities are sounding alarms too, with widening shortfalls in teacher and law enforcement pension programs. In a state this small, one major corporate downsizing or plant closure doesn't just hurt, it ripples across entire regions. Debt stress among residents is rising sharply. Credit card delinquency rates have pushed up to 6.3%, making Delaware one of the most financially strained states in the Mid-Atlantic. Number 8. Alaska. Alaska has always lived and died by one commodity: oil. When crude prices climb, the state surges with confidence. But when they slide, Alaska doesn't just slow down, it quakes, and right now the tremors are getting harder to ignore. In 2025, the state's longtime lifeline has turned into a critical weakness. Nearly 40% of Alaska's government budget relies on petroleum revenue. The problem? Alaska needs crude selling at $76 a barrel just to break even, yet prices have spent months hovering around $71. That gap may seem small, but here, it's the difference between stability and crisis. To stay afloat, leaders in Juneau have been draining financial reserves at a pace never seen before. The state is staring at a $1.2 billion deficit, and even the much-celebrated permanent fund, once a symbol of Alaska's economic strength, is being tapped simply to pay basic expenses and keep government lights on. It doesn't end there. Federal dollars make up another 40% of total state spending. In a national downturn, if Washington tightens the belt even slightly, Alaska loses oxygen. Meanwhile, people are leaving fast. For 3 straight years, Alaska has shed more than 12,000 residents annually, as workers chase more affordable living and better employment options in the lower 48. And despite the steady exodus, affordability remains strained. The median home price in Anchorage still sits near $394,000, while household incomes average around $86,300. It's expensive to stay, and increasingly harder to justify doing so. The energy sector, once the heartbeat of the state, is shrinking. A decade ago, oil and gas supported 13,500 jobs. Today that number is barely 8 fits. Tourism, Alaska's backup engine, isn't filling the gap either. Visitor travel slipped 9% in 2024, and cruise traffic remains below pre-pandemic norms. Real estate reflects the anxiety. Sales plunged 18% year over year, and housing inventory surged 32% as people list homes and plan their exit. Life in rural Alaska is particularly harsh. Unemployment in some regions exceeds 8%, and the cost of everyday goods is staggering. Milk around $7.50 a gallon, and bread topping $6 in multiple towns. For many families, survival is simply no longer affordable. Number 7. New Mexico. New Mexico sits at a dangerous intersection, dependent on federal money and tied to volatile energy markets. In a mild economy, that balance is fragile. In a recession, it becomes a direct threat to survival. Federal dollars make up nearly 43% of the state's budget, and oil and gas account for roughly 30% of total economic output. When government cuts collide with unstable oil prices, the state has nowhere to hide. More than 22,000 federal workers in New Mexico face the risk of pay freezes or layoffs if Washington tightens its purse strings. Economists warn that even a modest 10% reduction in federal contracts could erase 3% of the state's GDP overnight, a hit few states could absorb. And the energy shock is already here. Oil royalty revenue plunged 18% in 2024, forcing lawmakers in Santa Fe to brace for a $900 million deficit by 2026. That's not a budget scare, it's a fiscal cliff. New Mexico's housing market, once overlooked but stable, is rapidly deteriorating. In Albuquerque, median home prices near $327,000 have slid 9% since 2023, while listings have jumped nearly 25% as homeowners rush to sell. Foreclosures have doubled in just 12 months, and 4.8% of mortgages are now delinquent, one of the highest rates in the region. Households are buckling. Poverty grips 18.4% of residents, and the median income, $61,000, can't keep pace with soaring rent, energy bills, and grocery prices. Job creation has stalled at a mere 0.4%, and youth unemployment has climbed past 9%. Add in violent crime levels sitting more than 70% above the national average, and new investment becomes a tough sell. Even the state's retirement system is in trouble, carrying $14.6 billion in unfunded liabilities and only 62% funding. Meanwhile, industries once pitched as New Mexico's future, tourism, film, manufacturing, all contracted in 2024 as consumer spending cooled. The truth is stark. New Mexico's recent optimism was fueled by federal support and high oil prices, not sustainable growth. Now those pillars are shaking. With shrinking revenues, rising living costs, and deep structural dependency, the state is vulnerable to every shock the national recession sends its way. Number 6. Nevada. Nevada's pandemic-era boom has officially run out of gas. The state that rose on casinos, construction, and high-risk optimism is now experiencing one of the sharpest economic slowdowns in the country. Foreclosures are surging. 1 in every 326 homes is now in distress, the worst rate in the United States. Unemployment has jumped to 5.4%, up from 3.9% just a year earlier, erasing nearly all the momentum the state gained during its rebound years. Las Vegas, once the poster child for unstoppable growth, is now ground zero for financial strain. Housing inventory has soared nearly 45% year over year, 12 straight months of increases, signaling a market losing air quickly. Prices have already slipped 2.2%. And analysts warn a 10–12% drop could follow if tourism continues cooling and layoffs accelerate. Nevada's fiscal model has always been a gamble. Gaming taxes cover 42% of state operating funds, but casino revenue has slipped 8% from 2022 levels. Commercial real estate is also cracking under pressure. Vacancy rates have hit 24%, and delinquent property loans are up 38% in a single year. Households are straining at the seams. The typical mortgage payment in Las Vegas now exceeds $2,780 per month, while median income hovers around $78,000. That means families are devoting more than 43% of their take-home pay to housing alone, far above what economists consider healthy. Credit card delinquencies have climbed to 5.9%, the highest rate Nevada has ever recorded. Tourism, the lifeblood of Nevada's economy, is no longer the reliable engine it once was. Visitors are down 7%, convention bookings have fallen 15%, and companies are slashing business travel budgets as profits tighten. Construction, a key support industry tied to casino expansion and housing growth, has shed 12% of its workforce. Meanwhile, 14,000-plus homes in Clark County sit empty, either for sale or already in the foreclosure pipeline. On the government side, the warning sirens are blaring. State revenue dropped 6.3% in 2024, and budget officials are bracing for a $1 billion deficit by 2026 if trends continue. The truth is simple but harsh. Nevada never fully diversified beyond tourism, real estate, and speculation. When the good times roll, the state soars. When the economy tightens, the fall is swift and unforgiving. Number 5. Louisiana. Louisiana has been barely staying afloat for years, and now the waves are finally crashing in. The state has long depended on outside help to survive, and in today's tightening economy, that lifeline is slipping. Half of Louisiana's state budget comes from federal funding, and nearly 1 in 5 residents lives below the poverty line, making it one of the most financially vulnerable regions in America. With median household income sitting at only $56,000, everyday necessities, housing, insurance, utilities have surged more than 14% in the past year, squeezing already fragile households. New Orleans, once a symbol of grit and rebirth, is now leading a very different list. It currently ranks as the weakest housing market in the entire country. Home values have fallen 7.1% year over year, and analysts expect another 5.8% slide by mid-2025. In Orleans Parish, median prices have dropped to $245,000, while the time it takes to sell a home has jumped from 41 days to 74 days. Foreclosures are accelerating across the state, filings are up 34%, and 1 of every 402 homes is now at risk. The energy sector, once the backbone of Louisiana's economy, is showing deep strain. Oil and gas employment has tumbled 11% since 2022, and shifting federal policy combined with volatile crude prices has discouraged new investment. Insurance costs, already infamous here, have surged beyond what many families and businesses can handle. Major storms like Ida and Laura generated more than $20 billion in claims, and as a result, insurers have been abandoning the state, leaving residents stranded with skyrocketing premiums or no coverage at all. Commercial real estate is cracking as well. Office buildings in Baton Rouge sit 23% empty, and Shreveport is worse at 25% vacancy. Retail properties aren't faring better, with an 11% vacancy rate, the highest Louisiana has seen in 2 decades. On top of that, the public pension system shows $18.9 billion in unfunded obligations, setting taxpayers up for a heavy burden. State officials are already bracing for a $1.3 billion deficit in 2026, with few solutions on the table. A state once viewed as the cultural and industrial heart of the Gulf Coast is now dangerously close to becoming the first Deep South state to flirt with true financial collapse. Number 4. Florida. Florida's red-hot boom hasn't cooled, it's detonating in slow motion. For 3 years, the Sunshine State looked unstoppable. Families poured in from around the country. Developers couldn't build fast enough, and real estate prices soared like rockets. But underneath all the hype, a dangerous reality has taken shape, and now the stress fractures are impossible to ignore. At this moment, Florida holds 9 of the 15 most overpriced housing markets in the United States. Places such as Tampa, up 42%, Cape Coral, up 37%, are so inflated that experts warn they're sitting on bubble territory. The typical home runs about $417,000, yet the median household income is barely $67,917. To comfortably afford a mortgage at today's 7% rates, a family would need to earn around $120,000 a year, almost double what residents actually make. And the fallout is already showing up. Foreclosures are spiking, with 1 in every 242 homes heading toward default, the second worst rate in the country. In Lakeland, it's even more shocking. 1 in 172 homes is in foreclosure, the highest rate anywhere in America. Then there's the insurance nightmare. After Hurricane Ian racked up $112 billion in damage, insurance companies went into retreat mode. Premiums have exploded by over 45% since 2022, and homeowners are now shelling out an average of $6,000 a year, nearly 3 times the national average. Major insurers like Farmers and AAA have already pulled out, forcing millions of residents to scramble for protection or go without. Even renters aren't catching a break. Vacancy rates have climbed to 10%, HOA fees are up 15%, and wages simply can't keep pace. Job growth has slowed to 0.8%, inflation is still running above 4%, and tourism, a cornerstone of the state, slumped 6% last year. Florida's hospitality sector alone shed 18,000 jobs in 2024. Despite having strong population growth and national attention, Florida is now walking headfirst into a perfect economic storm. Sky-high home prices, an insurance industry collapsing under climate pressure, a cooling job market, and early signs that migration is slowing all point to trouble. Buyers who piled in at the peak in 2022 could soon be staring at losses of 30 to 40% as prices correct. Number 3, California. For decades, California was held up as the American dream in motion, a global powerhouse that rivaled entire nations. Today, that shine is dulled, and the Golden State is wrestling with the consequences of years of runaway spending, soaring living costs, and an economy stretched past its limits. The state is staring at a record-breaking $58 billion budget deficit, bigger than anything in its history. To stay afloat, lawmakers have already begun draining the rainy day fund, pulling $12 billion just to keep basic services operating. This isn't a subtle warning sign, it's a flashing red alarm. Housing is where the crisis hits hardest. The median home costs roughly $825,000, a figure so steep that you'd need to earn about $237,000 a year to buy one comfortably. But the median household income? Around $96,500, meaning the typical Californian makes less than half of what's required to purchase an average home. As a result, mortgage payments now hover around $5,900 a month, swallowing 36% of household income, the highest burden anywhere in the U.S., and people are leaving. In 2024 alone, 239,000 residents packed up and left, marking the largest domestic outmigration in the country. Meanwhile, the state's long-term obligations are staggering. California is weighed down by $244.9 billion in unfunded pension promises and another $20 billion in unemployment insurance debt. Schools aren't spared either. The public education system is facing a $5 billion funding shortfall, while tax revenue from the once unstoppable tech sector has dropped 21% as Silicon Valley's profits cool off. Commercial real estate paints an equally bleak picture. San Francisco's office vacancy rate now sits near 29%. Los Angeles has hit 22%, and the state is seeing about 187 commercial foreclosures every month, nearly a third of the entire nation's total. One symbolic collapse, the once iconic gas company tower in LA, valued at $632 million not long ago, is now staring down foreclosure around $200 million. On the streets, the crisis is unmistakable. More than 181,000 people are homeless, the largest unhoused population in America. Renting isn't much relief either. The median rent in LA is almost $2,950, and everyday costs continue to rise. Energy prices sit 42% above the national average, and utility bills jumped another 11% last year. Number 2. Illinois. If California is sliding, Illinois is already halfway down the cliff. This isn't just a state struggling with hard times, it's a jurisdiction built on a financial foundation that has been crumbling for decades. Corruption, Political short-termism and pension promises the state could never actually afford have created an economy that's not merely strained, it's fundamentally cracked. Let the numbers speak. Every taxpayer in Illinois effectively carries almost $39,000 in state debt on their shoulders. In total, the state is buried under $172.8 billion in unfunded liabilities, placing it among the worst-managed states in the country, 48th out of 50 in fiscal health, sitting only slightly above New Jersey and Connecticut. And the problem isn't stabilizing, it's accelerating. Analysts expect a $3.2 to $5.1 billion budget shortfall by 2026, even under optimistic assumptions. The situation becomes even more alarming when you look at pensions. The teachers' retirement system, once considered one of Illinois' proudest institutions, is now just 34% funded. At its current trajectory, the fund could effectively run out within 20 years. In other words, tens of thousands of current and future retirees are counting on money that simply isn't there. Chicago, the beating heart of the state's economy, tells the same story in sharper strokes. Property taxes in the city have jumped 16% since 2021, while violent crime has risen 34% over the past 5 years. Businesses are fleeing downtown, and office vacancies have reached 18.8%, with commercial rents dropping from $34 per square foot before the pandemic to about $27 today. Nearly 2,000 bank-owned properties now sit empty across the metro, the highest total anywhere in America. Residents are voting with their feet. Illinois lost 84,000 people in 2024, the 9th year in a row that the population shrank. Every household that leaves takes tax revenue with it, tightening the noose further. At the same time, energy costs in Illinois run 18% above the national average, and real incomes have barely moved since 2019. Illinois isn't simply mismanaged, it's trapped. Raise taxes and even more families and companies leave. Slash spending and you threaten retirees, teachers, and public infrastructure. There is no painless lever left to pull. Number 1. New Jersey. New Jersey's financial crisis isn't looming in the distance, it's breathing down its neck. Of all the struggling states in America, this one stands closest to the edge, with almost no time left to correct course. State financial auditors recently issued a warning that reads like a countdown. New Jersey has enough operating reserves to survive only 2 days. That's not a cushion, that's a red blinking light on the dashboard. Every taxpayer in the state is essentially carrying a $44,500 bill just to keep basic operations running. And the bigger picture is even more dire. Over $220 billion in unfunded liabilities, a mountain of debt built over decades of political promises and fiscal denial. The state's largest pension fund, the teachers' retirement system, is a case study in crisis. It is only 34.7% funded, making it the weakest major pension system in the country. Despite years of raising taxes and squeezing residents harder, New Jersey hasn't closed the gap, it has widened. Budget forecasters expect a $5.3 billion deficit by 2026, and if the state's revenue falls just 5%, even its much-touted rainy day fund will evaporate within a single quarter. The housing market tells the same story of pressure and fragility. New Jersey now has the second highest foreclosure rate in America at 1 in every 359 homes. In Atlantic City, it's closer to 1 in 200, a number that echoes the darkest days of economic collapse. Yet somehow home prices shot up 19% in 1 year to a median of $539,000, even as inventory rises and mortgage rates hover near 7%. It's a textbook bubble forming right before the storm. Commercial real estate isn't faring better. Along the Newark-Jersey City corridor, office vacancies exceed 19%, and about 42 commercial properties fall into foreclosure every month. Meanwhile, the everyday cost of living is suffocating residents. The average property tax bill is nearly $900 a year, the highest in the entire country. Power bills run 33% above the national average, and insurance costs climbed another 12% in 2024. And for all that cost, the state economy barely moves. Growth limped in at 0.7%, well under the national pace. New Jersey has become a paradox in real time. High salaries paired with high stress, high incomes paired with higher bills, a dense, wealthy population trapped in a fiscal cage built from pensions, taxes, and years of financial avoidance. Even infrastructure spending, critical in a state dependent on roads, rails, and bridges, can't keep up with aging systems buckling under use and neglect.